All right, well, it looks like our participation is starting to level off, so I will go ahead and get started with announcements. Good afternoon, I'm Dottie Head, I'm the Director of Communications for Georgia Audubon, and we're delighted that you are joining us this afternoon. It's a beautiful day out, and we appreciate you taking some time to come to our presentation. I have a couple of quick announcements before I introduce our presenter. Georgia Audubon is going to be co-hosting the 3 Billion Art Exhibit with Brickworks Gallery at the Hudgens Center for Art and Learning in Gwinnett County. There will be an opening event on February the 6th, but the show will run from February 6th through 24th. It is free to attend, and there are tickets required for the opening. They're timed tickets. Everything is got safety protocols in place for the pandemic, but you can get those free tickets via our website. I will post a link to that as soon as I get done introducing Dr. Nobles. And we will also be having on our February 28th monthly meeting, which is 4 weeks from today, we're going to have a guided tour of this exhibit with some interviews with some of the artists hosted by Laura Adams, who is the owner of Brickworks Gallery and has the curator of this exhibit. On February 27th and 28th, we're excited to be co-hosting the Georgia Native Plant Society's annual symposium. This will also be a virtual event. There's a very small charge to attend. And the speakers are going to include Dr. Patrick McMillan, the director of Heronswood, Jim Osier with Georgia Power Company, Malcolm Hodges, retired Nature Conservancy, and Gift Beaton, a noted author and naturalist. You can register for these events on our website as well, or on the Georgia Native Plant Society website. On Friday, January 29th, which is next Friday at 9 a.m., we're going to be having our next Facebook Live virtual field trip. If you'd like to watch that, join us on the Georgia Audubon Facebook page. It's always a lot of fun. Finally, Michelle asked me to announce that we recently released the artwork for the Georgia Birdfest 2021 t-shirts, which features a ruby-throated hummingbird. And we are, since we're not able to gather in person this year, we decided we're going to pre-sell shirts so that we don't get stuck with a bunch of shirts that we don't have a place to sell. And I'll post a link as soon as I get done, but they're on the website and they're super cute shirts. So hope you'll order one and we will get those shipped out to you in early February. Finally, speaking of Georgia Bird Fest, that's going to run this year from April 17th to May 16th, and is going to include a variety of virtual and in-person events and speakers, field trips, workshops, etc., that you've come to know and love. Registration is going to open on Tuesday, March 2nd at 10 a.m. to current Georgia Audubon members. So make sure your membership is current and that you know how to log into your account at Georgia Audubon, because as usual, we anticipate some of our events will sell out in minutes. So you don't want to miss out. Finally, if you're not a member of Georgia Audubon, we hope you will consider joining the flock. We'd love to have you. You can find more information on our website at georgiaaudubon.org. Right before I introduce Dr. Nobles, we're going to be taking questions and answers. You can either type in the Q&A box or in the chat, and I will relay the questions to him once he's finished with his program. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter today. Dr. Gregory Nobles is a retired Professor Emeritus of History at the Georgia Institute of Technology, where he spent more than 30 years teaching early American history and environmental history. After retiring from Georgia Tech, Nobles was named a Mellon Distinguished Scholar in Residence at the American Antiquarian Society, the Robert Ritchie Distinguished Scholar in Residence at the Huntington Library in San Marino, California. His latest book, which he'll be discussing today, John James Audubon, The Nature of the American Woodsman, was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2017. Since retiring, Dr. Nobles has been dividing his time between Atlanta, where he is a member of Georgia Audubon, and North Point, Michigan, where he is a member of Michigan Audubon. So with that, Dr. Nobles, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Dottie, and a few other thank yous as well. I'd very much like to thank Melanie Furr of Georgia Audubon and her colleagues in the book group. We just had a wonderful hour before this. And speaking of books, I'd like to thank Doug Robinson and his colleagues at Eagle Eye Bookstore for providing copies of the book. And I assume they might still have some there. So thank you very much. But above all, thanks to all of you for zooming in this afternoon. It is a lovely day. And I want to take some time, and maybe not too much time. I think I'm going to try to keep my presentation to around 25 minutes or so we can have time for the questions and answers that Dottie mentioned a moment ago. I am a historian, and I have written about John James Audubon. And today I want to talk about Audubon himself as a historian of America. And to do that, I want to begin briefly with a little bit of background biographical information on Audubon, just to set him in context. Here he is. Audubon was born in Saint-Domingue, or what's now Haiti, in 1785. When he was a very young boy, a toddler, his father sent him to France, where he had property. Audubon grew up in France in the city of Nantes, or near the city of Nantes. And in 1803, his father sent him to the United States, partly to get him out of the draft. Napoleon was looking to conscript soldiers, and Audubon's father thought, that's not for my son. So he sent him to America, to Pennsylvania, to oversee a farm that Senior Audubon had here. And Audubon really spends most of his adult life back and forth between the United States and Great Britain, where he produces his remarkable work, The Birds of America. But Audubon adopts the United States as his home. He identifies with, he embraces America. He calls himself the American Woodsman, takes on this almost hyper-American identity. And you can see in the images here, these are 4 paintings of Audubon from 1826 to 1843. You can see how being American Woodsman aged him over the course of 17 years. But you can also see the most important tool of his trade, and that's his gun. And we'll talk about that perhaps a bit more in the Q&A. But we know Audubon best as a bird artist. In fact, I think we can call him arguably the best bird artist there ever has been. And I will give you a few, I think, familiar examples of his artistry. Here is, of course, for the Georgia Audubon Society, the red-headed woodpecker, the adults feeding the juveniles. This is a very familiar image of the American flamingo. I show this because one of the things Audubon did, and he set out to do this from the very beginning, is to portray each bird full size of life, he called it. And his image is 30 by 40 inches, and he's able to get every bird in there, sometimes with a little bit of bending, as in the case of this flamingo, but nonetheless, there's a bird in full size, and you can get so close to these birds. You can examine them up close and personal in a way that you simply cannot do in the field. Here's another one of my favorites. This is the snowy egret. And again, remarkable detail in this painting. You can see every feather. And Audubon is all about the birds. He never includes people in the pictures, almost never. And this is the one exception. This is the one exception. You can see perhaps way down in the lower right-hand corner, just below the stream there, a small human figure. I'll blow that up a bit. It's a small man walking toward the egret from the house, carrying a gun, perhaps going to hunt. Some people argue this is probably a small self-portrait of Audubon. But it's the only time in Audubon's published work that we find a human figure in the frame. There was almost another. And this is, again, one of my favorite Audubon images. This is a watercolor for the golden eagle, where the eagle has picked up a rabbit. But you can see this time down in the left-hand corner, lower left-hand corner, a small figure crawling across a log over a very, very deep and dangerous precipice. And again, here's a blow-up of that. You can see the figure. Once again, probably a self-portrait of Audubon, showing the rigors of ornithological research, all the dangers he went to collect his birds. But in the end, that figure's taken out. And this is the final engraving of the golden eagle. And for whatever reason, and I wish I knew, I wish somebody would tell me, the human figure is removed. And otherwise, all of Audubon's images, all of Audubon's works in the Birds of America, it's all about the birds. And it's 4 volumes, 435 plates. It is a truly, truly remarkable work. And I think most of us would have to agree to that. Now, I have to admit here, there are occasions, and one of them is today, when I will say some things that are critical of Audubon, not so much of his artwork, but of his writing and his positions on American society. But I want to be very clear that I always have to take a moment and express my deep, deep admiration for his work. First of all, just the ambition. The idea that he would go out and try to collect every bird in America and depict it in paint and then have it engraved in England. And he would make this collection, put it all together in 4 big volumes, each one, again, 30 by 40 inches. It was the ambition, and I think also the execution. He did it, and he did it remarkably well. And I think if you ever have an opportunity to see a full volume, or maybe even all 4 volumes of Audubon's work together, it's just a dramatic experience, and one I hope everybody has an opportunity to enjoy. But beyond the Birds of America, what Audubon called his great work, and a great work it really was, Audubon created another remarkable work to go along with that. And it's called Ornithological Biography. A book he created, actually 5 books, 5 volumes, 3,000 pages of writings to accompany America. And he gives very, very detailed descriptions of the birds. But he also gives information and descriptions of people too. Sometimes himself, most times himself, in fact, but occasionally other people. And he puts these stories in to Birds of America, to Ornithological Biography, excuse me, as he says, to relieve the tedium of ornithology. He knows that chapter after chapter about birds is going to get a bit boring. And so every 10 chapters, he throws in something, a story about American people and American society to kind of liven things up. Now, I have to say, some of these stories may or may not be true. My sense is most of them are not true. Audubon's one of those people who never let the truth stand in the way of a good story. But I think these stories give us Audubon's version of American history. It's through these stories that we see what Audubon thinks and what he writes about his adopted homeland, the United States. And it's in the first volume of Ornithological Biography, in a chapter about the Ohio River, he gives us his view of American history, and he does it in simply one sentence. But here's that sentence. This is a sentence of 263 words. It has 7 semicolons. It goes on and on forever. If one of my students had written this sentence in a paper, I would have circled it and said revise, rewrite, but I can't do that to Audubon. But I've highlighted a few phrases here, and you can read it perhaps on the screen, but I'll try to summarize it a bit. He talks about coming to America's uninhabited shores, seeing the dense and lofty summits of the forest that at the time when he first got here, he said were unmolested by the axe. But then he begins to turn and talk about the differences, what's happened in the course of his being in America. There are no longer any Aborigines, he said, and the herds of elk and deer and buffalo have ceased to exist. America used to be in a state of nature, he said, but it's now more or less covered with villages, farms, and towns. And the woods are fast disappearing under the axe. And steamboats, those symbols of commerce and technology, are beginning to go up and down the rivers. And he talks about the destruction of the forest and how people are coming still to transplant civilization into the darkest recesses of the American environment. And finally, he ends this sentence by saying, when I remember that these extraordinary changes have all taken place in a short period of 20 years, the 20 years of Audubon's being in America, he said, I pause, wonder, and although I know all to be fact, I can scarcely believe it's reality. Well, when I got to the end of that sentence, with all this environmental change, all this social change taking place, I say, wow, what does Audubon think of all this? What's the takeaway? And he gives it to us in the next sentence. And again, one much shorter sentence. Whether these things for the better or worse, I shall not pretend to say. Now, when I first read that, I just reacted. I said, what? You've laid out this whole picture of America, of American history, of American environmental and social change, and then he just walks away from it. What did it all mean? I shall not pretend to say. Well, Audubon does pretend to say in some of the other chapters in Ornithological Biography, and I'll note just 3 this afternoon. There are more, quite a few more, but I'm going to focus just on 3. The first one is writing about the passenger pigeon. And Audubon, like everybody who talks about the passenger pigeon in the 19th century, notes the remarkable flocks of passenger pigeons that will darken the sky, literally, for days. And Audubon tries to figure out how many are there? And he looks at the sky and he does a quick calculation, or maybe not so quick actually, and he comes up with this number, 1.1 billion and change per flock. And that's what he sees, that's what he says is up there. But Audubon also writes about passenger pigeons, not just about the bird, but the people on the ground who like to shoot them. And people shoot them by the thousands. There are records of whole villages, towns turning out to shoot into the sky, to bring the pigeons down, and then, of course, to eat them. Audubon, I will say, is himself quite a connoisseur of bird recipes. He likes to shoot them himself, and he also likes to eat them. And Ornithological Biography carries numerous references to Audubon's taste in birds. But in the case of the passenger pigeon, he says, maybe not to worry after all this shooting and eating. These birds reproduce quickly, he says, they'll be okay. It's only the destruction of their habitat that might do them in. I've been satisfied that nothing but the gradual diminution of our forest can accomplish their decrease. And that, of course, is exactly what happens. Audubon dies in 1851 in New York. The last passenger pigeon dies in 1914 in the Cincinnati Zoo. Audubon didn't live to see that, but perhaps he could see it coming. In another chapter in Ornithological Biography, he sees destruction and writes about destruction up close. And in this case, he takes a trip to Labrador in 1833. He's going there looking for puffins and gulls and guillemots and other birds. But he also finds other people looking for these birds. Maybe not the birds themselves, but their eggs. And he writes about what he calls the eggers, these men who collect the eggs to sell on the market. And Audubon is appalled. He rails against them. He rails against them for their destructiveness, for their sheer greed. And he also sees the danger that they pose. Audubon himself collects eggs, but he does so, he says, for the sake of science. But the eggers are doing it for money, and they don't care. They don't care how dangerous this behavior is toward the future of the avian species. And I think in this chapter, Audubon speaks to a bigger issue. He looks at more than just eggs in Labrador. He's looking at the environment in general, or at least pointing us to it. It's the commercialization of nature for profit. And that's what the eggers represent. And that's why they are so disgraceful in Audubon's eyes. And he says the dollars alone chink in the eggers' sordid mind. There's one other issue that's an especially sordid issue, and that's slavery. It is perhaps the most important issue in Audubon's era in the 1820s and 30s and 40s. It's still, of course, a very important issue in our own. And in 1834, Audubon publishes a remarkable story he calls The Runaway. And the timing is critical. It's just 3 years after Nat Turner's slave rebellion in Southampton County, Virginia. Nat Turner's rebellion was an uprising that failed, but it didn't fail to alarm white Americans. And this is an image, a very common image at the time of Nat Turner's capture. And Nat Turner's story is a story that everybody in America, North and South, knows quite well and finds terrifying. And Audubon opens his own story of the Runaway with an image that is very much like this, an image that is sure to alarm his white readership. And it's the image of a black man with a gun. And he talks about being out in the alluvial swamps, he calls them, of Louisiana. And then sometime late in the afternoon, he hears what he calls a stentorial voice commanded me to stand still or die. And soon Audubon sees this tall, firmly built Negro coming out of the bush. And it's a frightening moment. Well, it turns out this black man does have a gun, but it's an old rusty gun. It probably doesn't work. Audubon has a gun of his own. He never goes out without a gun. And he creates in the outset this very scary scene, this standoff between a black man with a gun and a white man with a gun. But as the story unfolds, it's not about the guns, it's about the situation of the two men. And the runaway, the man he encounters in the woods, tells Audubon that he and his wife and his two children are hiding out. They had been living on a plantation in Louisiana. They had been enslaved there. But then the owner sold them off. The owner sold them to two other plantations, sending the man to one plantation and sending the wife and children to another. He broke up the family. And so the man, the runaway, himself escapes again, goes to find his wife and children, gathers them up, brings them back into the woods, and there they're hiding out when they find Audubon, or frankly, when he finds them. They're hiding in the woods, and they beg Audubon, "What can you do?" "Master," the runaway says, "I'm a runaway. I might shoot you, but for God's sake, don't kill me, master." And the runaway begs Audubon for help, for some kind of assistance. So Audubon, as the story goes, camps out with the runaways overnight. He sleeps on it and he thinks about it. And the next morning he wakes up and he has a plan. He takes them back to the original plantation where the first owner had owned them. The first owner then buys them back from their more recent owners. And that's that. That's that for Audubon. Audubon takes off. He leaves the scene, apparently satisfied that the enslaved people are okay, or as happy as slaves generally are in that country. And again, when I read that, I had to stop and say, what? What are you talking about? How happy is that? They're still enslaved. They're back with the original owner, but they're still human property. And so what is Audubon telling us in this story? What's he telling us about slavery? What is he telling us really about himself? He portrays himself as a friend to the runaways, somebody who's trying to help them, but he doesn't help them stay away from slavery. He also is a friend to the slave owner. He helps keep them in slavery. And then he walks away. It's not his problem. He goes away and simply leaves them in their enslaved condition. And here I think is where Audubon's own story, a bit of Audubon's own biography, comes into play about slavery. In 1833 and 1834, Audubon had written about his impatience with, his frustration with, really his opposition to emancipation, to the abolitionist movement, both in England, where he had been living for a while, but also in the United States. And Audubon says that the British government, by giving emancipation to slaves, had acted, as he puts it, imprudently and too precipitously. But Audubon had taken his own steps on slavery. He himself had been a slaveholder at various times in his life, and he had supported, he had benefited from the slave system. And that's an important part about Audubon's own story, about Audubon's own history as an American. Now, I'll say I wrote an essay that was published in Audubon magazine last summer. Perhaps you saw it, perhaps not. dealing with Audubon and his position on slavery, I don't really intend to rehash it here, although I'd be happy to talk about it during the question and answer period. But it's a part of Audubon's life we simply can't escape. We simply can't look away from. And I want to close here by being very clear about Audubon, and in the process, perhaps being clear about us. I do not expect Audubon to be intellectually consistent. And believe me, he isn't. You can read Audubon chapter after chapter. You can find contradictions, you can find complications, but you'll never find the kind of intellectual consistency you might expect from a writer. But Audubon's a naturalist. He's a painter. And I have to give him some room. He's not a historian. He's certainly not an academic. And maybe, in fact, when he looks at what's going on in America, he simply cannot pretend to say what it all means. But maybe we can, or maybe we can try. Maybe we can see that we can't separate natural history from human history. We can't just look at birds by themselves in some isolated environment. And again, I go back to this image of the snowy egret. We can be astounded by their beauty, as I think most of us as birders are. We can look at these images in loving detail. And again, you can get so close to this egret in this picture, and you can see every feather, you can see every bit of this bird. But we also have to be aware that we are like the little guy in the picture, the little man in the lower part. That's not just Audubon, that's me. And that's you as well. And the question is who we are and what we do. And I think we have to ask some questions, especially as we are members of the Audubon Society. Can we do a better job than Audubon himself did about creating opportunity and equity and inclusion for Black people or all people of color in the Audubon Society? Can we see that we have our own tools of destruction? Maybe not a gun, as is pictured here, but our houses, our cars, even our computers, all those things that are burning up fossil fuels and changing the climate every day as we continue to use them. Can we see the connection between how we live and how birds live, or how birds die? I received today a communication from the National Audubon Society, as many of you probably did, talking about that the safety of birds, the preservation of birds, is critical to our own preservation as human beings. And these ideas are very, very much linked. And I think as we want to preserve birds, we have to think about how we preserve ourselves, and as we preserve ourselves, how we preserve the environment. We are, I think, beginning to move in the right direction, thanks to the Audubon Society, thanks to a lot of good people in America and American history. When will we get there? In this case, I'm a bit like Audubon. I shall not pretend to say, but I will be very happy to hear what you have to say in your questions about Audubon and your questions about American history. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Dottie and invite your questions, and I hope be able to answer them.
Yes, Greg, so far we've had one question. Somebody wanted to know if Audubon actually studied to be an artist.
Well, he did, not in quite the way that he said. He claimed to have studied with David, the very famous French painter, while he was living in France. That turns out not to be true. Audubon was largely self-taught, but as I think we can see, he learned his own lessons quite well. He did not go to the academy. He was not formally educated in art, but he became remarkably well self-educated.
Any idea how long it took him to complete a painting?
Some he did rather quickly. There's an interesting process in that. He would typically kill a particular bird, and then he would fix it up on a little frame he had, or he would pose it in some way using a frame and then some string. He would sketch it. He would do a watercolor. He would then send that watercolor to England, where it'd be engraved by Robert Havell and company. The painting, sometimes he would work feverishly. The painting I showed you, the Golden Eagle, he worked on straight through for several days. He almost, he said, killed himself doing it. That was a very big and dramatic painting, a difficult one for him. Some of the others, I think he did a lot more quickly, and he had some help in a few cases of other people, assistants. So he would paint the bird, they would provide the background. But it could be several days at a time, and to do it with, and eventually make 435 plates, I think is a remarkable level of productivity, if nothing else.
Do you know what prompted him to have the engravings made from the watercolors?
Well, that's the way they could be reproduced and sold. Okay. You know, each watercolor is a one-off product. An engraving can be reproduced many times over. It's a fascinating process. I had to learn something about it. It's etched into big copper plates. Very skilled artists, very skilled artisans are doing the etching. And then each plate is blacked over with ink. It's pressed onto paper. There's an outline in black and white of the bird, of the whole scene. And then individual hand painters come in, and the colorists, he called them, and they fill in all the colors. They're mostly young women working for not much money. And Audubon was always getting unhappy about the lack of consistency. He expresses great admiration for the engravers, but great frustration with the colorist. And they're always the people who are on his list. And he's always telling Robert Havell, who runs the shop in London, to keep an eye on them, make sure they do the job right, make sure they get it right. And so every original Audubon you see, whether it's in a bound volume or as many of them have been cut up for sale, each one is hand colored, each one is hand produced. But that the engraving enabled him to sell the copies and to make a good deal of money.
Do you know if he ever visited Georgia or Alabama? And if so, did he paint any birds from here?
He doesn't have any from here. He spent a lot of time in Florida, a lot of time in South Carolina. One of his best friends was the Reverend John Bachman, and they went out birding all the time. Audubon spent a lot of time in Florida down on the St. Johns River, but I don't think he really spent time actually killing and depicting birds in Georgia.
Do you think he considered himself more of an artist or a scientist?
He considered himself both. We see him mostly as an artist, of course. I think he was very proud of his position as a man of science, very jealous of the hostility that some other people in the scientific community expressed toward him. If you ask Audubon to separate art and science in his work, I don't think he would do it. I don't think he could do it. And as you look at, and I urge people, if they can, to look at Ornithological Biography, it's available not just in research libraries. Happily, the University of Pittsburgh has put it online so you can read it very easily. 3,000 pages of scientific writing with, again, these anecdotes thrown in to break up what he says was the tedium of it all. But it's remarkably detailed ornithological description, and it's very, very good. And Audubon, I think, was very conscious, very self-conscious, really, of his standing as a gentleman of science. He finally got into the loftiest scientific organization in America in 1830-31, the American Philosophical Society. And some of his scientific rivals, enemies, had kept him out, but he finally got in, and this was one of the greatest achievements of his life as a gentleman of science, as they like to call themselves.
Let's see. Any thoughts on his personality and why he avoided putting humans in his paintings?
His personality is one of, he was quite a personality. He was quite an ego, but he was also a very talented man. He was an artist, we've seen that. He was a scientist. He was a musician. He was a storyteller. He was a ladies' man. He had a remarkably vibrant personality. I've sometimes joked that if I ever had lunch with Audubon, I'd never get a word in edgewise. And as to why he didn't put people in the picture, at least in the image picture, I think he doesn't want to distract from the birds themselves. He sometimes shows as background human habitations. You can see it here in the one of the snowy egret, but sometimes there'll be pictures of Charleston or other cityscapes, but they're way, way back in the background. He's much more interested in the birds. And it's his task, it's his passion. He wants to depict every bird of America, full size, in great detail. And he succeeds at that. The people he saves for his writing, the people he saves, and he can then kind of lighten up, perhaps jazz up the ornithological detail a bit.
How many copies of his volumes were produced, and do any of the original etchings still exist?
Well, there are about 200 volumes all told. They don't all exist now. I think there may be 105, 106. Some of them were lost, some were damaged, and some, frankly, were cut up. Macy's department store in the 1930s took several, I think at least 2 volumes of the Birds of America, cut them up, sold the engravings individually. Their notion was it's much more democratic. You can have an Audubon in your house. You could never afford the whole collection of all 4 volumes, but you can have 1, maybe you can have 2. And so some of the volumes were simply destroyed, at least the bindings taken off. You can see several copies of Audubon's Birds of America in all 4 volumes at various research libraries and some universities. At the Huntington Library, where I had a fellowship to do research on this book, there's a copy of the Birds of America in the library, and every so often, every 6 weeks ago, they'll very slowly and laboriously and carefully turn the page. And so over time, you can see all the images, but and you know, they're available elsewhere. All the watercolors, happily, are the New York Historical Society in New York City. After Audubon died, his wife, Lucy, who was a long-suffering mate, needed money. And she had all of Audubon's watercolors. And rather than give them up and just let them go, she sold them to the New York Historical Society. The New York Historical Society now has them all in its collection, and you can look at them there. And it was just a great acquisition for that organization. The engravings themselves, the copper plates, are available in some places. I've seen some. They're as remarkable in many ways as the engravings themselves, the colored images. If you go to the Audubon Museum in Henderson, Kentucky, where Audubon lived part of his life, they have a couple on the wall. If you get a chance to see them, they are certainly worth seeing. And they're just the copper engravings, but you can begin to see, you can begin to imagine how this then transforms itself into the beautiful images that Audubon made. Many of them, though, the copper plates got melted down, some were burned in a fire, some were sold for scrap. And again, the Audubon family, after Audubon died, needed money. And sometimes they did what they could to get it.
Was Audubon married?
Yes, he was. Amazingly enough, only once. He married Lucy Bakewell, a woman from an English family living in Pennsylvania. And they lived a good part of their lives apart. Audubon was back and forth between the United States and Great Britain while the Birds of America was being produced. Lucy was down in Louisiana for a while, teaching school, trying to support him and his lifestyle on the other side of the Atlantic, and also trying to support their 2 sons. And they have a very, I think, very painful correspondence that goes back and forth. He's always saying to her, why don't you come over here to England? But not yet. And she's saying to him, why don't you come back here? And their relationship as husband and wife is very strained. but it's also remarkably durable. Lucy does go to England for a while, helps him with the production of the Birds of America, helps him supervise the colorist, frankly. She helps him write Ornithological Biography. She is very much a contributor to, a participant in the creation of Audubon's great work. She outlives him, and she lives in New York and dies not in poverty, but in need. There's a book by a woman historian named Carolyn DeLotte about Lucy Audubon, about Audubon's life from Lucy's side. There are a couple novels about Audubon, about his married life and frankly his love life. So those are worth looking at too.
As a historian, when telling the story of figures who both made valued contributions to society and participated in human rights violations such as slavery, what is your general strategy for balancing these truths?
I'm not sure they can be balanced. I think they need to be put forward. They need to be laid out there. I think we need to recognize both. And this is why I think Audubon is such a fascinating, but also troublesome character. I can't anymore, as a historian, as someone who's spent a lot of time with Audubon, simply look at his work and say, well, he was a great scientist, he was a great artist. I can't get over the fact that he was also a slaveholder. On the other hand, I can't simply reject Audubon's work. I can't reject his artistic and scientific legacy because he was a slaveholder. I think one of the critical issues for us as we look at Audubon, and frankly, as we look at the Audubon Society, is to try to find some, if not balance, if not reconciliation, at least recognition of those two sides of Audubon. And it needs to be addressed. It needs to be understood. And what people make of it is up to them. But I think we can't simply pretend, as I think a lot of people did in the past, either that Audubon was not a slaveholder, or if he was simply, as people like to say, a man of his time. There are a lot of other people of his time, men and women, who had many different positions on slavery. And it's not something that we could take automatically as just the way things were back in the 19th century.
Somebody asks, how did you get the eagle picture with the man on the tree, since that was not the final picture? Are there any other preliminary sketches or watercolors still in existence?
That was a watercolor, and that one is in the New York Historical Society, which has published a book of Audubon's watercolors, kind of, if you would, the first draft of his Birds of America. And all the watercolors are available. You have to go to the New York Historical Society to get them, or to look at them. But again, they're published in books as well.
Did he paint any subjects besides birds?
He did sometimes, yeah. Early on, when he needed money, he painted signs for bars and taverns and that kind of thing. He painted a few portraits of people, or at least head portraits. He hated it. He hated painting people, but he needed the money. And so when he was living in New Orleans for a while, he was making money a little bit doing head portraits for $5 a pop. But that was not what he wanted. That was not his mission. That was not his calling. That was not his commitment. He did it to get by. And he doesn't have any, big landscapes to speak of. All of his paintings, with a few exceptions for people that we don't really have anymore, are about the birds.
Would he have known William Bartram or been familiar with his work?
He was familiar with Bartram's work, not with Bartram himself. Audubon's main contemporary, at least for a while in his work, was Alexander Wilson, who did know Bartram. Wilson was a Scotsman who came to America in the early part of the 19th century, was the first one in the 19th century to set out to do what Audubon set out to do, and that was to paint every bird of America. Wilson died in 1813. He didn't live long enough to do as much as Audubon did. Perhaps he couldn't have done as much as Audubon did. But I think Audubon, didn't know personally, but he was part of and wanted to be part of the scientific community in Philadelphia, which was the America's city of science in the early part of the 19th century. And he very much wanted entree into that world, and it took him a long time to get it.
Has a digital replica of his work been made?
The images or the ornithological biography?
I don't know. He didn't specify.
Okay.
Just read the question.
The answer to both is yes. You can find Audubon images anywhere on the web. And as I said, thank you to the University of Pittsburgh for digitizing and making available on the web all of Audubon's ornithological biography in the way it appeared in the 19th century. It's not just a transcript, it is image of each page. And so you can get a sense there of what this work looked like to people who were using it, who were reading it at the time.
Have you ever encountered a particular plate where the background done by others detracts from the painting?
Detracts from the painting?
Yes.
No, I don't think so, because the birds are always front and center. We have hanging in our dining room, thanks to my wife, Audubon's image of the belted kingfishers. And there are 3 kingfishers in the foreground. In the background, there's a river scene and some tree stumps and so forth. It's not very dramatic, but it doesn't really detract from looking at the kingfishers. And I think that, Audubon's work, again, the birds are always foregrounded. I suppose if you looked at the image I had of the golden eagle, such a dramatic background with the craggy mountain peaks and the precipice and all that, some people might find that a distraction. I find it, frankly, a pretty interesting context.
Did he actually paint every bird species in America? If so, how many states at that time, and were any additional species discovered later?
Yeah, there were. He did 435 plates. And I think, and this came up a little bit earlier when I was talking to the folks in the book club, he painted maybe 490 something species, but there are more species in America. And of course, he never went west of the Rockies. Oh. He went as far as the upper Midwest, up to the Dakotas, but never went west of the Rockies. So, all the things you would find in the Bird Guide, the Sibley or the Peterson, west of the Rockies, he didn't get those for the most part. He had a couple of friends, John Kirk Townsend and Thomas Nuttall, who did go as far as Oregon. In fact, they went as far as Hawaii, but they went as far as Oregon. And they sent back bird specimens, bird skins to Audubon, and he painted those. Actually, that caused him a little bit of trouble because they sent back a bunch of woodpeckers that were, of course, dead, and they were just the skins. Audubon identified them as different species. And so there's one painting that he has of, I think, 8, perhaps 9 woodpeckers. Each one of them he's named, Lewis's woodpecker, Maria's woodpecker, Harris's woodpecker. And they're all pretty much different molts, different versions of a hairy woodpecker. And so he made some mistakes. But I think also, he was very keen, as people of science were in the 19th century, to be the discoverer and to get to name something. You can't name something after yourself. Otherwise, everything would be Audubon's work. But you can name them for your friends. And then your friends can name something for you. And that's the way scientific naming worked in the early part of the 19th century. The use of the Linnaean binomials, of course, but the popular name, Bachman's warbler. That was named for his friend John Bachman.
Why were other scientists reluctant to accept him into their circles?
Well, the person who really led most of the opposition to Audubon was a man named George Ord, who was a member of the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, but had also been a friend, supporter, and really, I guess for lack of a better term, executor of Alexander Wilson, who had begun to depict the birds of America before Audubon. After Wilson died, Ord became very jealous of, hostile toward Audubon, and didn't want him to surpass Wilson. And so Ord did everything he could to block Audubon. When Audubon was living in Philadelphia and wanted to get a Philadelphia printer and engraver for his images, he couldn't find one. They all said, sorry, can't do it. And a lot of that was Ord's influence. Audubon tried to go to New York to get an engraver there, and he couldn't get one. He finally had to go to England, first to Scotland, to Edinburgh, and then finally to London. So why the hostility toward him? I think there was some possessiveness on the part of Ord and some of his allies to Audubon, and his attempt to rise to fame. Some people thought Audubon was not a good scientist. Some people thought that he was not accurate in his depictions. Some thought that he was being a little fast and loose with ornithological truth. And so he had his detractors on both sides of the Atlantic. In fact, George Ord had a friend, a British friend named Charles Waterton, and they spent an enormous amount of time trying to undermine Audubon's reputation. Just one example, Audubon has an image of mockingbirds in a tree, and there's a snake climbing up the tree. And there's a whole battle. Can snakes climb trees? And Ord and Waterton said, no, of course not, they can't. Audubon said, yes, they can. And so they go back and forth, and finally Audubon tries to come up with proof that in fact snakes can climb trees. This is not an issue that would grip us right now, probably, but it was one that was, again, part of the coming to truth, coming to proof in the scientific community in the early part of the 19th century, when it was still a game that was open to amateurs. There were no science departments for the most part in universities. There was no school of ornithology. Anybody could play. And Audubon was one of those people, but he played remarkably well. But sometimes people didn't think he always played by the best scientific rules.
Was there only one painting with no backup copy, and did any of the paintings get damaged in transport to Scotland or England?
Not that I know of. I don't think he had backups. And he had to be very, very careful, sometimes taking the watercolors with him himself to be sure that they were well cared for. I don't know of any, and he doesn't write about any that are damaged in transit or that are completely lost. So he got lucky in that regard, or maybe he just got careful.
Were Wilson's paintings engraved as well?
They were, and they were good. I think Audubon would say, and frankly, I would say, they're not as good as Audubon's. You know, Wilson's figures tended to be a little bit stiffer, not quite the same degree of detail that Audubon has. And of course, what Audubon does that nobody really had done before him was to put birds into action, put them in movement. There's a lot of emotion, a lot of activity in Audubon's engravings, in his paintings. They're not just the kind of stiff profiles you might see in a bird guide today, a Sibley or a Peterson. And a lot of people who painted birds at the time did do that. And Audubon did that starting out as a young man. But I think what makes his work distinctive and what makes it so artistically fascinating is the way in which he uses his images, not just to show a bird, but to put the bird in real life. And sometimes that life is violent. The image, again, I showed you of the golden eagle is a case in point. There's the eagle grasping the white rabbit, but also, at least in the watercolor, the prospect of the man falling off that log into the precipice. There's a lot of danger in Audubon's paintings, or at least in many of them. They're not just nice little bird pictures.
Did any of his sons follow birds?
Yeah, both of them did. Both of them got brought into the family business, and it was a family business. Audubon engaged his wife in helping out. He got both of his sons, Victor and John, to help him. They sometimes did when Audubon, actually the Audubon family decided that once they had created the big birds of America, what they call the double elephant folios, the big 30 by 40 inch collections that went for $1,000, which was a huge amount of money at the time. They came up with a smaller version that would be more affordable, and the Sons were in charge of that for a while.
Did he ever make any sketches in the field of live birds, or only the ones that he'd shot?
As far as I know, only the ones he had shot. Sketching live birds is hard. You know, they move around a lot.
They move.
And it's difficult. He might have gotten some of his notions of how he wanted to pose the birds, as it were, from from seeing them in the field and seeing how the birds actually moved. When some people question, for instance, I show you the image of Audubon and the flamingo. The flamingo is in this rather contorted position to get the whole body in. And people raise that question. And Audubon said, no, I've seen that. I've seen them do that. And so, you know, everything was life size, and in Audubon's telling, everything true to life as well.
Did he ever indicate a favorite species?
No, he wrote favorably about a lot. Like a lot of people, he was not very fond of bald eagles. They had kind of a bad reputation in the early part of the 19th century. He has a lot of kind things to say about purple martins, how useful they are and how people like them. But I don't think he ever really declared a single species as his one and true favorite. I think people who look at Audubon's images can pick out a few favorites. We tend, of course, to go for the big birds rather than the small ones. But you know, I think he knew that the big birds were more valuable commercially, but he also wanted to do the small ones as well, because his task, his mission, was to get everything, or everything he could. And I think, you know, I think the fact that he came so close is a remarkable and astounding part of his story.
Are there any other compendias of his work that was not bird related?
Well, there are a couple of collections of Audubon's writings. Some of his journals, some of his correspondence, and yeah, some of the chapters from Ornithological Biography. And that has some material that's not directly bird related in terms of descriptions of birds. It has some material where Audubon is writing sometimes about his scientific competition, sometimes about the whole production of making the birds of America, and sometimes simply about his travels. So yeah, there's one edited by a man named Christoph Irmscher, the Library of America collection. Another collection came out a few years ago by Richard Rhodes, and they're just you know, various extracts of Audubon's writings, whether they're personal correspondence or scientific extracts.
Right. Well, Greg, that about wraps up the questions. Thank you so much for This was a fascinating presentation. I learned a lot, which is great. We appreciate your participating both in the book club and in our monthly meeting today. And you all, we will make a recording of this and make it available on our website. Thank you very much for coming, and we hope to see you at some of our events, our February 28th monthly meeting next month with the tour of the 3 billion exhibit. But again, Dr. Nobles, thank you very much for your time, and you all have a great afternoon.
I look forward to it, and thank you very much for this opportunity.
That's great.
Thank you.